Hey everybody, John Ray with Musing Wizard, and of course, we are continuing our Wizard Chat series with Carl Brockman, and today we're going to be talking about fear. Are you afraid of something? Have you had fear in the past? If you're human, likely it's there, unless you went into robot mode and completely compartmentalized it off. Fear is a very natural part of the human experience, and it's our relationship with fear and our ability to feel through it and work with it that allows it to be valuable to us. And so today we're going to be unpacking each of our perspectives on fear, some of the fears that we have, the processes that we use to move through fear, and how fear can actually be beneficial when utilized in the proper way. So, Carl, thanks for being here. Let's talk about fear.
Oh, I'm a bit nervous, eh? I'm a bit fearful to have this conversation, but no, lovely to be here, John. Thank you for having me. And yeah, excited to talk about this topic. Excited to talk about fear. It's quite an interesting thing to say in hindsight. But yeah, one of the things that you introduced in the introduction to this podcast was the value of fear. And for me, thinking about fear quite a lot, fear has been something that I've worked more consciously to understand over the last few years of my development. And we'll get into what that's meant for me and what that's led to. But from your perspective, John, what value lives in fear?
Yeah, well, from a spiritual alchemist point of view, fear is a catalyzing event. So if we recognize that reality is a mirror that kind of operates as this energetic acupuncture artist, and an acupuncturist is poking you in the meridian line or the place in your body that energy needs to move to. So anytime you're triggered emotionally, and that triggering usually comes up as a base level emotion, fear being one of those, that triggering is actually the universe or God or reality or life or the simulation, whatever label you want to give it, poking you in your energy field in a space that is basically saying, I've looked at your desires, we've mapped the potentials of those desires, and for you to be able to actualize them, you need to transmute some of the denser level energy in your system and in your field in order to move into probabilities that are of a higher frequency. And so fear becomes a catalyzing opportunity for us to transmute base level energies into something that is more akin to creative potential that can then be directed towards the desires that we want. So a good example is yesterday I was on, I'm doing a bunch of podcasts and Twitter Spaces calls right now for a project launch that I have. And in one of the calls, I got to connect with a really high level person that runs a big project, very well respected. They know a lot about the space. They've been in the space for a very long time. And so they are a mentor figure to me. They have more expertise. They have more hours of mastery. And even though I consider myself to be somewhat at a level of mastery, this person was light years ahead of me because they've just been in the game way longer. But we got into dialogue on this Twitter space, and they were asking me some questions that are important questions to ask, but difficult questions for me to answer because I hadn't fully thought through them all yet. And in that moment, a tinge of fear came up because there's thousands of people on this call, and I knew that these people are assessing whether or not they should engage with my project. And so through a series of asking him some questions back, I gave myself a container and a space to just literally feel that fear as sensation in my body. And as I felt that fear as sensation, it became so clear to me that this was an opportunity to make an ally out of this person. And so I said, I'd really love to turn the question back on you, because if I'm being totally honest, we haven't fully thought through those things. And as you know, in crypto, many things get put on the back burner in the early stages of building a hive mind, in hopes that the hive mind will then be able to solve some of those problems down the line. And so I said, I'd love to invite you into our hive mind to help me think about some of these intellectual property questions that you're bringing up. Would it be okay for us to sync? And do you have a hot take on it right now that you could share? Well, this completely changed the dynamic of the conversation. He booked on my Calendly. Now he's going to come in basically as an advisor to help. And the conversation turned from what could have very easily been an accusatory tone to him wanting to operate as that mentor and take me under his wing. And so had I operated from that place of fear and tried to shove that down, and what do you do when you're shoving your fear down? You usually bullshit somebody. That's when you lie because you don't want to feel the discomfort. And so lying feels like it's going to not be as uncomfortable because in that moment you got away with it. But then of course down the line it's going to be way more uncomfortable because you're going to get found out or you're just going to have a bunch of guilt about it. So rather than going that route, I felt my feelings as well as I could in the moment. And I used it as a catalyzing event to build a bridge into a larger opportunity. And that's how fear can operate as a source of alchemy catalyzation.
Beautifully said, and what a good recent experience to unpack how important it is to, well, again, to if we're just going to be a broken record in these chats, it's to feel your feelings. How does fear manifest when it's not felt, when it's run away from, when it's shoved down? It does. It manifests in emotional reaction. It manifests in lies. It manifests in I see myself maybe 10 years ago in that conversation, John, and not having the answer. Maybe I'm trying to oversell myself now, or just overcompensate for that state of lack. And to go back to value of fear for a second, fear kept us alive. Like through our evolution, fear
That's right.
kept us away from trying to pat a tiger, from trying to hang with chimpanzees in the jungle. Fear kept us alive. It's in our DNA. And what I've come to really understand as I now work with men and even business owners and myself is that most of our fear is unconscious, especially in the macro. And if we don't have an awareness of the fear that is guiding our behavior, then again, are we playing an optimal game? Are we playing the right game? Are we working to mitigate or overcome the right fear? In that conversation, the micro fear of being found out versus the macro fear of this project not launching effectively. What is the more important fear to mitigate and overcome? And just the opportunity to feel those feelings allows you to achieve both. It's like now you have credibility because you're not trying to oversell yourself or lie or say something you're not, but also you've now through alignment and vibration engaged someone in the field who's now going to help that project be more successful.
Exactly. And the key and the reason that the only advice that I have for anyone is you got to learn how to feel your feelings at the sensation level is that it's very easy to over intellectualize this and then try to calculate what I just said. So try to mentally calculate how you're going to respond and treat it like a chess game and map it all out. And that's so energy exhausting when you do that. And I see people all the time trying to like memorize books and memorize strategies, and it's so much more energy efficient to just feel your feelings and then be naturally inspired to what the right action is. I know you're reading Robert Greene's Mastery right now. It's a great book. All of his books are great books, but very often people point to those books as being these kind of Machiavellian type strategies for how the patriarchy, took over the world. And in many ways it is, because it's a history study of how people rose to power. But what gets missed in his books is that ultimately, when you're looking at each of the rules that he outlines for mastery or power or all of these various things that he's written about, the key behind each of those rules is actualizing, like knowing yourself. Once you know yourself, those rules naturally play themselves out. And so people think that Napoleon was calculating. People think that all of these people that he writes about, that in their journal they were plotting what every single step was going to be. No, these are people that had deep gut intuition because they knew themselves at a nervous system level, and then they just enacted those inspired impulses. And then as a historian, we can look back and we can pretend that it was all calculated, but so much of that was birthed out of an intuition, out of a gut feeling. And in hindsight, it looks genius, but was the genius calculated from the intellect, or was it somebody that was so actualized and seated in themselves that they were always able to pick up the signal from reality that put them in the optimal place? And I'll argue that the latter is the case with almost all of those people. But of course, in hindsight, when you're looking back on how your most inspired gut feelings play themselves out, it will look like you were taking a practical strategy, but at the time, it didn't seem as practical.
Yeah, you can always connect the dots backwards. You can always connect the dots backwards. And yeah, so beautifully pointed in those two pieces of work in particular from Robert Greene, the 48 Laws of Power. Again, I did when I first read that book years ago. I had that visceral sort of, I don't want to. I don't want to play that game, but in reality, yeah, how people function together. There's a lot of merit, and obviously in some of these strategies, but the strategies themselves, to take them black and white, I tend to agree, might not be the best way forward. One example I wanted to pull out from Mastery was Carl Jung, and Carl Jung being attracted to Sigmund Freud and being able to learn from a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist in their field that he truly respected. But Carl's intuition stopped him from being completely married to Sigmund's point of view, particularly about sex. And initially, Carl thought, oh, well, that means I'm wrong and I need to try and overcome these things in myself. Otherwise, I'm not going to actualize. I'm not going to get to a level of respect that I see for myself. When in turn, it was the integration of those feelings that allowed him to explore archetypes and other different paths above and beyond Sigmund Freud's work, on the shoulders of the giant of Sigmund Freud's work. Yeah. And Robert Greene points so beautifully to the importance of the apprentice coming out from the shadow of the master. And I think the one thing that we can most of us can resonate with is our father as a man. At one stage, our father is no longer this all-seeing, all-being God that knows everything. We start to see him as human, then we start to be able to come out from the shadow and walk our own path. But some of us don't. Some of us have the fear that keeps us in the box, keeps him on this pedestal. And it isn't until an external catalysm, like you pointed out before, perhaps your father passing away, that creates a sudden awareness of it. Mm. It's all on me now. What am I going to do? And again, just a little nod to why I think it's really great to do some fear work. And the best lowest barrier to entry fear work that I would recommend is just sitting with yourself. Broken record, but ask yourself, what am I afraid of? Ultimately, what am I afraid of?
Yeah, exactly. And your fears are going to dictate your unconscious and conscious desires. And we were talking about a little bit before this call, this concept of like being called into the game that you're called into, and that there's an infinite level of games, and some games are matrix based games, and some games are part of an elevated consciousness system, and we can really only explore the games that we have a desire to explore, because without the desire, we can't direct our attention towards them. But oftentimes we play very small games because we have very small desires, because we have so much fear around having a big desire and then not being able to actualize it. And for many people, that this is why they play a small game, and this is why they prefer to complain about things than try to solve problems, because in trying to solve something, you might fail at solving it. And then not only are you disappointed about the situation that you are already in, but you're disappointed in yourself that you didn't seem to be capable of solving that. And so the paradox is that as you feel through that fear, and oftentimes there's a shame or guilt associated with it, you will land upon the solutions in the moment that allow you to then elevate out of your circumstances. And there's a beautiful path that I think happens as you start to spin out your karmic energies, which are just kind of these energy impulses that we've talked about before, on this call, and eventually your desires become something otherworldly, right? They become elevated beyond the physical plane, but you are where you are, and your desires are what your desires are, and ultimately your desires are linked to the karmic energies or the impulses that are ready to express through you and then transmute into higher frequency. And so as a node that's transmuting that energy, that's why following the breadcrumb path of your interest is the most optimal way for you to actualize that energy and transmute it into something higher. and ultimately you may get to a place where you have desires that are different from most of the people on the planet. But I really do believe that ultimately we keep our desires small, or we stop dreaming bigger because we hit a place of fear that's too uncomfortable to feel through. And of course, that's just a label that we put on it. There's no feeling that we can't feel through, and there's always a state of elevation. But part of the reason that sitting with yourself, whether that be in meditation or through some kind of somatic practice, is important, is because it allows you to get a sense of where that fear lives. And part of the expansion process is being able to connect with it. Feeling your fear is shadow work. That's what that is. And so shadow work is all about you accelerating the process by searching out the fear rather than waiting for it.
Yeah, or the alternative, which is just behave unconsciously in line with
That's right.
the fear that might not be conscious either. And you pointed to a very common fear, and one that I've definitely felt and continue to feel, which is uh, the consequence of doing ideal work or having any vision of the future is exactly that. It's a separation. It's the difference between now and then, and what if I do fail? What if I can't figure it out? You do have all of these internal fears based on this ideal. The other fear that really speaks to me, and if you'll allow me to just share a little bit about my journey to this point, I was a very insecure young man in high school. I just didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. I had a lot of friends, yeah, but in hindsight, it was probably just because I wanted them to be happy, and I would just do whatever I could for the people around me to be happy. And in that process, I would just be observing, like, what makes that person cool, what makes that person funny, what makes that person great, why do I respect this person, what don't I respect about that person, and I was always in a state of outwardly observing the people around me, and almost like being a charmeleon in just reflecting back what I thought was appropriate to whatever the person was. And that created this relationship of status, in which my status would be bared on what I thought someone else thought of me, my perception of what what I think someone thinks of me, right? And now suddenly I have this fear, not only of an ideal or something worth striving for, but what other people think of it.
Mhm.
Like, who are you to? And this links to Australian culture, and we have this syndrome called tall poppy syndrome, where the poppy that rises above the crowd gets cut down. And so, like, who am I to have an ideal so high? Who am I to try to achieve something more? Who am I to think that going to the pokies and drinking a beer every single weekend isn't the best way to live life, right? And so not only do I have this internal disposition, I have this external disposition, and I have a fear of not being accepted, and this then manifests and handicaps me along my journey, nowhere near as much now as it did in the past, as you can imagine.
Yeah. Well, it's and I'm trying to think about the school body of thought that calls it this, but basically the term that they use is telepathic projections. So telepathic projections can be you projecting onto someone else that they're projecting onto you. So it's actually your own projection onto yourself
Yeah,
but you're using the excuse of somebody
an
else to do
avatar.
it.
Yeah,
And that's what you're talking about, the tall poppy syndrome. But then there's also real telepathic projections where somebody else actually is projecting onto you. How could you think about that? And so through law of attraction, and that term gets muddied through all of the various schools that use it, but this idea that you're always going to be put in contact with the thing that is most optimally serving your largest desires. And so if your life is full of frustration right now, that is a clear indication that you're not feeling that energy as sensation in your body for long enough or often enough, because once you clear that energy and you literally dissolve it by putting your attention on it, by noticing it, by having a curiosity about it, and then letting that kind of disperse as heat until it's back in your field as creative potential. When you do that, reality no longer has to trigger you with frustrating events because you've released the energy that it was designed to trigger. And so telepathic projections, whether real or invented by our own imagination, it doesn't really matter because a thought is a law of attraction event. And so if we're thinking about the projection from any perspective, the solution is always, okay, well, if that was real, how do I feel about that? And then you immediately move it down into your body, you clear the energy, and then you act from the place of inspired impulse or inspired action. And in that way, you can consistently elevate your desires. And the actualization process is learning how to do that very quickly and consistently moving into larger and larger desires. And then who knows what the largest desire is. Like I'm not there yet, but maybe the largest desire is to be desireless, but you're desiring being desireless. And so it's a
Yeah.
it's a paradoxical state, but it's really hard to live a desireless life when you haven't burned out all of the energy of the desires that you actually have.
Yeah, so true. And I guess that relates so perfectly to playing the game that is calling us at any moment, right? Playing the game that we see as optimal from any stage, and doing our best to discern our own path forward in that state, you know. Uh, what are you afraid of?
I mean, I'm afraid that something will be too uncomfortable, that in order to elevate my frequency to an optimal place to be able to achieve something big, that I'll have to go through seasons of discomfort that don't feel worth it, and that at some point I'll give up on that process, and then I'll never actually actualize the thing that I want. And so part of the reason that having conversations like this on a regular basis is useful for me is because it's good to have a reminder, whether I'm listening to someone else or I'm just saying it out loud, and then I'm like, all right, that is what I believe. Like it forces me to continue to put these things into practice and principle, and then just like any good hypothesis, I can prove it out over time. And then I have a strengthened conviction about those things because I've seen them play themselves out. And then that gives me the courage to keep moving forward, even in moments of temporary discomfort. So there's very little that I have activated in my system as like a chronic fear, like something that I'm chronically afraid of. But if there was one, it's kind of the potential of fear itself becoming so big that I wouldn't feel capable of feeling through it to the other side of it, and I would just give up, and then I would be trapped in a small game. So fortunately, I've definitely been scared a lot, but I am so trained at sitting with that fear that it's never plagued me for an extended period of time in my recent history.
And to use some wise words that were once sent to me back to the person that said them to me, because you're aware of that fear, it will never manifest.
Right. And that's the interesting thing is that like the fear which until it's actualized, you, once fear is actualized, you're not really afraid of it anymore. Then it's more like grief, like you're grieving the fact that it happened. So fear is always a future potential because you're fearing that something is going to happen. Once it happens, it's a completely different set of emotions. It's disappointment, it's grief, it's anger, but it's no longer fear. And so fear is always a future tense. And the interesting thing is that in this magnetism that we have in our field, our ability to render reality around us based on the way that we're filtering energy through our system, when we can feel through the fear in those early stages, and if we're afraid it's an early stage because it hasn't happened yet, um then there's an opportunity to reduce the way that wave of potential collapses into something that is not aligned with that fear. But if we are a Chicken Little running around, like the sky is falling all the time, what all we're doing is we're just sending energy to the probability that that will actually happen.
Was thinking about what my recent strategies for fear have been, and I guess they're just probably a more convoluted way. to sit and feel the fear. And one of the strategies that I use in my work and personally is almost like a comparison. It's like the feeling of fear that you feel now compared to what? You know, I alluded to it a little bit earlier. It's like, well, what is the ultimate fear? What's the macro fear? What is the real fear that you want to orient towards to mitigate or overcome? Uh, that ability to to write down and take out of my head to make it objective, and now to have a bearing of comparison has really helped me over the last few years. And I guess, like I just pointed to, that is just a probably more convoluted strategy to feel the fear that I'm feeling in any given moment.
Right. Well, depending on how atrophied our nervous systems are, it may seem very difficult to feel fully through a fear. And so then intellectual strategies can kind of be a way to dip our toe into the water of that
Mm.
feeling a little at a time. But ultimately, like, I'm a rip the band-aid off and let's get it over with type of guy. And so just kind of letting all of that come on and play out in your nervous system, you get to the point where, just like if you go to the gym every single day, your nervous system can handle anything and it can process it very quickly, there's a level of energetic container that you can create for yourself where you recognize that, like, there's not even a nervous system. It's just all energy playing itself out. And so then it processes even faster. And the game that I play with myself is, okay, clearly, like, I have some resistance towards something, which means that there's a fear that something's going to happen. So what's the worst case scenario that I'm afraid of? Okay, let me build out the holographic vision of what that would look like what would actually happen. And so I will build out a holographic vision of how bad that would actually be and force myself to feel how uncomfortable it would be. And then I say, well, how would I handle that? If as I've kind of built out that picture, felt the discomfort, the squirming of it. Okay, well, how would I handle that? As a thought experiment, the worst case scenario happened. How would I handle it? I'm still alive. I have to do something. So what would I do? And then immediately, because you've already confronted the fear to some extent, and so whether you're consciously or unconsciously doing it, just looking at the fear forces you to feel it a little bit. So you start to grasp some of the solutions that would be available in that moment. And then the fear starts to dissipate because you're like, wow, I would be able to handle it. Like, it would be one hell of a tailspin, but I'd be able to pull out of it. And then it just makes a more epic chapter in the ultimate biography that gets written about me. Whether that be the cosmic biography or the one that Walter Isaacson writes. So that, like, the fact of the matter is that we're all living out an adventure, and adventures are kind of full of moments like this, and that's what creates the catalyzing energy that allows us to keep going forward, because when something negative happens to us, it grows the desire for something positive, and then we have more energy that can be directed towards that. And so, you know, I will go through that thought process to the point where I'm like, okay, well, if the worst case scenario happened, I'd be able to deal with it. And so then you've really kicked the legs out from underneath that fear. You've likely felt through some of it. And so then I take the opposite stance. What would be the best case scenario? Like, if everything worked out perfectly, what would that look like and what would that feel like? So now you've felt through some of that fear. You're probably more in alignment with some of the optimal solutions. You start to put all of that together of what the optimal, best case scenario looks like. And then you go, well, how would I handle that if it played out like that? And so now it's like, oh, well, then I'd get to do this. We could do this. I'd be able to hire these people. Now you're so amped up in your energy that what are you doing? You're now directing all of the fear that got transmuted back into creative potential. And so now it's in a delta neutral state. You need to put that energy somewhere, because it's latent in your field. So now we're practicing the best case scenario and we're directing all of that creative potential towards that. And in the probability wave of our decision space, we're just ramping up our brain's ability to see and choose optimal scenarios. And that's how life works. And my optimal scenario is going to be different from your optimal scenario, is going to be different from the next guy's optimal scenario based on our life experience, based on where we're at in our journey. But we're not trying to get to a final resting place. We're trying to have progress towards a goal. Like the fun part is EV positive elevation, and any good poker player recognizes that being a winning poker player is not about never losing. It's about being able to feel through the losses to the point where you're willing to go back to the table and to play optimally enough in an EV positive way where over a long enough time period, you're on an upward trajectory. And that's what all of life is you identifying the decisions that are going to put you in an EV positive upslant.
Oh, I love getting the deep wisdom, and then I love getting these offshoot recommendations, and that one for me just strikes so beautifully. I can't wait to get off this call and just go to the casino. It's just gamble, gamble, gamble until you win. So thanks. John Ray says gamble, never give up. If you don't give up, you'll win.
Do your own research, but I will say that when you're in alignment in this way, it's much more likely that you're going to be in an EV positive position at the poker player, at the blackjack table, et cetera. And so the concept of lady luck, and what is it? It's just a belief system that someone has rigged reality against you. So that's an EV positive energy state. And of course, anyone who has gambled enough recognizes that you get on a hot streak, and that sometimes those hot streaks can be induced, and sometimes it's just superstitions, but superstitions are just a permission slip for you to be in alignment about what you're doing. So definitely don't ever go to the casino if you feel guilty about it.
Oh, no, very well said. And yeah, like you got to be in it to win it. You know, that old cliche, the more times you rock up, the more times you have to win. Like I've got one mate who just has been a pokey man. I don't, are pokies big in the States?
I
Like
don't know
slot
what a
machines?
pokey is. We call it something
Slot
else, I think.
machines?
Oh, slot machines? Sure, yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay. But they're not everywhere. They're not abundant in the
Well,
States, are
gambling's illegal in many states of the United States. So in
they?
states that gambling is legal, slot machines are in every gas station.
Right. Okay. Because in Australia, gambling is like the lifeblood blood of our culture. You know,
Oh,
gambling is
interesting.
everywhere. Every single pub, or what would you call them, like a tavern, or
Yeah,
just places you
a
go get a
bar.
beer. There's bar. There's pokies.
Yeah.
Pokies in every alcoholic establishment. We love the pokies. One of my really good friends has just been a pokies fiend since we came of age, and he just is always winning these big prizes, always sending photos of these $1,000 jackpot wins. And of course, he's putting the money in, obviously,
Sure.
but he has this positive relationship with it.
Right.
He's just rocking up at the right time.
Yeah.
He's in it to win it.
I've won more random odds casino events, more raffles, more radio contests than any human should. But a big part of it is that I just believe that that life favors me, and so I just enter
Yeah.
more of them. And you know, the thing to always track when it comes to gambling, because you know, people talk about Alcoholics Anonymous a lot, and we may have talked about this before. Like, it's tragic when somebody's addicted to drugs and alcohol, but if you really want to hear some tragic stories, go to Gamblers Anonymous, because that's where
Yeah.
people are losing life fortunes. That's when people are jumping out of windows, and it's really tragic. And most people in Gamblers Anonymous aren't pokey addicts. You know,
Yeah.
they're not casino addicts. They're Wall Street people. They're people in crypto, and you know, they're
High
losing
stakes.
millions of dollars. And so whether you're putting a quarter in a slot machine and pulling the lever, whether you're buying a lotto ticket, whether you're going to the casino, or whether you're gambling in the crypto and stock market, your relationship with that always has to be discovered in your nervous system. Are you doing it out of an unconscious impulse, or are you conscious in your intentions behind it? And oftentimes people get caught in a loop of, you know, just buying scratch off tickets, spending $20-$40 a week on scratch off tickets, because they're not addressing the fears that they have that they're not going to be able to get it in any other way. And so it gives them a type of temporary alignment the way that alcohol would, where at least there's the potential for some temporary relief in that moment. Before I recognize that the ticket's not a loser, I get to feel the feeling of, but what if it is? And so that is an interesting permission slip to, for a hot second, have a sense of alignment. And more power if that's the only way that you can find that. But really, the deeper thing is to analyze what's the fear behind the fact that I can't get this money in any other way. One of the reasons that I haven't been playing as much poker as I used to play, because I used to play a lot of poker, and I was a good winning poker player. But one of the things that I recognized was that I was limiting my winning potential because I was investing so much time into something that um, didn't have an exponential curve on it, because I was too afraid to play in the higher stakes where it would have the exponential curve that I wanted it to have. And so I recognized that for me, the outcome that I was trying to get in poker was an optimal EV positive relationship with my hourly time. And I recognized that my time would net a better yield doing something other than poker, because when I took all my poker winnings together, I recognized that my coaching rate and my consulting rate was higher than the rate that I was earning per hour at the poker table. So that was me having to feel through some of that discomfort that I had. And at some point I could definitely see myself going back to like accepting some of those fears and playing in some of those higher stakes games, and having my own relationship with my own fear around it, and potentially becoming a professional poker player. But right now that doesn't feel like the strongest desire for me. And the relationship that I had with the game of poker was really more about me being able to have intimate knowledge of my nervous system, because poker and all zero sum sports are a great way for you to have to feel your feelings and then empathically feel other people's feelings and interpret that energy.
Beautiful link back to fear, and I just wanted to go back to the activity to almost create a holographic of what the worst case scenario is and what the best case scenario is. I see a lot of value in doing that. One of the other things that comes from me when I do consider the worst case scenario, or what the ultimate fear is that sometimes I laugh at it. Sometimes I just feel so silly that I'm afraid of that. Like you pointed to, like if you ever get to that situation, what would you do about it? That it just seems, as I've processed that and worked through that, it's just so obvious what I would do if that was ever to eventuate. And then I feel silly for even being fearful of that in the first place. Like, one example in my early 20s was, as I started walking a different path and perhaps taking aspects of my life a little bit more seriously than my friendship group, one of my fears was that I would be left out. I wouldn't have these friends anymore. I wouldn't be able to connect with these people that I love so much and have so much love for, and I get back. And to play that out, it's like, well, if you lose them with your friends in the first place, and you've made friends before, you can make friends again, and you'll probably make better friends because you're on this path that's intuitive to you. And funnily enough, as you play it out, no, I still have those friends, and they're bloody amazing, and I love them so much. But I also have some new friends that I get to connect with and have relationships with.
Yeah.
When you can you go back to a John that loved to drink. He grew up with his very, from my perspective, alternative parents, and had a very interesting household compared to what perhaps the norm is. What were some fears that compounded in your early life, John, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that my parents, though they came from very alternative backgrounds, when they had children, they decided to raise them as fundamental Christians. So I grew
Right,
up in a very
yeah.
strict household. And then when I turned 18, they decided to go back to their alternative roots.
Just an 18-year break. Now we'll make sure John has his head on, and then we'll go back to what we feel
Exactly.
is the yeah.
So when I was growing up as a child, my biggest fear was that I would be ostracized from my friend groups because my parents wouldn't let me do something. Also, like I grew up, my parents didn't have a lot of money, and I had a lot of very wealthy friends, and so my fear was always that I was going to be judged for not having money, that I wouldn't fit in, because I couldn't afford the ski trip, or I couldn't afford to go on the beach trip. My friends were constantly like doing these really amazing things, but they were expensive things, and their parents all just gave them a Discover card, and they got to do whatever they want. And so at growing up, my fear was I'll miss out, because my parents are poor. And
Mm.
I didn't have the language for it at the time, or even like a conscious process. But rather than succumbing to that fear, I took my parents' lawnmower and I just started knocking on doors, and I mowed enough lawns to go on every ski trip, every beach trip. I worked out relationships with the business to be an advocate or an ambassador for them so that I could go for free. I used creativity as currency. And of course, long term, that served me way better than my wealthy friends who had a Discover card in their pocket. And so I wouldn't change it at all now. But my fear was always, I'm a recovering people pleaser, and so as a kid I was a people pleaser. I needed people to like me, and when people didn't like me, it was very uncomfortable, and I didn't always have the tools to feel through those feelings, and so then I would act out, through stealing things, or drinking, or doing drugs, or acting out in school. Like these were things that were a projection of that discomfort. They were designed to get me out of that feeling of discomfort, because, oh, if I can just get everybody in the class to laugh, then I won't have to feel the discomfort that I have temporarily. So it all stems from the fact that I was unconscious of my own discomfort, and because I was unconscious of it, I was unwilling to address it and sit with it and process through it, and because of that, it just bubbled out as unconscious bad behavior.
I like the term recovering people pleaser. That might be in my new LinkedIn tagline. Carl Brockman, recovering people pleaser. I resonate so much with that experience. As I alluded to earlier, I won't go back over it in detail, but it's just another nod or opportunity to create awareness around how fear manifests into behavior and action, whether you're conscious of it or not, and the opportunity to, again, to use an alchemical sort of principle, to turn base metal into gold, to take that fear and actually do something about it, let you create, let you manifest behavior in a way that overcomes that fear, but allows you to, well, to mitigate, to outgrow, to overcome something that from your perspective held you back or put you in a state of lack or made you less than. uh, what about when you started working for yourself? I know you've already, sorry, from my perspective, John, you've always had this uh, perspective of working for yourself, even when it was for another business. You used the PT sales example, then you used your time at Google as another example. I always got the perception of the inkling that it was still you operating your own thing, even though it might have been in a different system. Do you remember any fears that were prevalent in your, I guess, breakaway from Google?
Yeah, well, maybe a better time was before I was at Google. My brother and I were running a video production company for 10 years, and we were both
Oh wow.
raging alcoholics and drug addicts, and it was the perfect business to be in, because we were working with musical artists, and so we got to sleep all day long and then go hang out at the clubs with video cameras all night, and then hang out on the tour bus, until the wee hours of the morning. And so we did that for 10 years, and it was interesting because we were so in the flow of that, of just being absolute degenerates, that even though every single month, we barely made our rent, we barely paid our bills, we barely had enough money, but we always did have enough. And it was because there was a certain standard that we were holding ourselves to, and it was very low at that point in time, and we were hitting the standard. You're always going to live up to the standard that you have for yourself. And I can remember, rent being due the next day, and us having like negative dollars in a bank account, and me being like, okay, I'm going to go find us a client. and I would literally go downtown and I would take shots with people, and I would party with people until I found a client, and then I would get them to see the vision of what my brother and I could do for them with a music video or with a rockumentary, or I mean, this is pre-YouTube. And then the next day I would follow up with them and be like, "Were you serious?" And almost always they were like, "Yeah, let's do it." And then I would, sometimes I couldn't even afford enough gas to go in my car, so I'd have to walk to their office across town and get a check, and then like hope that my bank would cash it even though I had a negative account balance. And then we always made our rent, or even if we didn't make our rent on time, we always made our rent on before we got evicted. Like I had such a good relationship with every apartment manager that I ever where I lived, either the realtors in the homes that I lived, or the manager of the apartment complexes that I was in, or the condos that we lived in downtown. Three scenarios are coming to mind in three different properties, and in all three of those scenarios, I just, people liked me, and so they never triggered the consequences of those actions, and so my brother and I got to get away with everything for so long, and it was because for the most part we were highly functional drug addicts and alcoholics, and we were so in alignment. We absolutely loved what we were doing, and it didn't matter. Those things, like, it never once bothered me that our rent was late. Now, that was probably because I wasn't holding myself to a level of integrity that I do now. It would totally bother me now. But back then I was like, whatever, what's 10 days late? We know we're gonna get it eventually. And so it's interesting how, as we tightened the level of integrity that we had, as we raised our standard of living and said, no, I'm never going to drop below this standard again, you just don't drop below your standard. And one of the most detrimental things about drugs and alcohol is that it convinces you that you don't need a high standard. And you could argue that a very low standard of living is totally acceptable, but choosing into that standard is much better than having it forced upon you. And I feel like when my brother and I were in that situation, in many ways 80% of us were choosing into it. We just loved what we were doing. We loved being able to party all the time. And so it didn't even occur to us that something else was available. But there was always 20% that's gnawing. That's like in the yin yang. That's like the black and the white and the white and the black. There was always a little bit that was like, we could be doing more than this. And ultimately, that is what happened. We went on to do much more than that. And we quit drugs and alcohol, both of us, and we created a different kind of relationship with reality, but still one where we were hyper aligned with what we were doing and just lit up by the actions that we got to take every day.
Yeah, what insight to the standard we have for ourselves, and that's another thing that so many of us have defined based on unconscious fears. You mentioned choosing an agency, right? And the alternative perhaps being a path or a standard forced on you. The other thing that I see is, well, the one that you unconsciously subscribe to, back to the pendulums thing. It's like, oh yeah, I am in this group of energy now. Here's my standard and I'm meeting that. So yeah.
Exactly. And I used to hitchhike all over the country, and so I hung out with a lot of homeless people. And one of the most interesting things that people don't really understand, I think, about the homeless population is that almost all of them are choosing that lifestyle because they do not want to subscribe to the rigidity of societal norms. And of course, there's fears underlying that, because you can break out above societal norms too, and that's actually a more, for me, it's a more interesting thing.
It seems like a funner game to play. Yeah,
Right. But you can live under the societal norms or above them and avoid that Venn diagram of getting sucked into what Pink Floyd would call the machine. And that's a choice. And so some people fear getting sucked into and becoming a cog in that machine so much that they would rather lower their standard of living and find absolute alignment with that than try to move through the discomfort of that middle bell curve that you have to go through before you exit the other side.
Yeah, some of the most interesting chats I've had have been with homeless people at like stupid o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, sleep deprived and other things abundant. And I remember one so clearly. I was in a backpackers down on the Gold Coast here in Queensland, and it was like, yeah, like I said, probably 5 in the morning. The sun was starting to come up. I wasn't having a cigarette, mum, I promise, but I was sitting on like a lounge, and this homeless guy comes up and asked not me for a cigarette, someone else that was there. And I was like, yeah, sure, mate. Yeah, take a seat. What's going on? And this guy was just so conscious, so intelligent, such a interesting character of person. Like I would walk past him and be like, oh, yeah, like you just put this person in a box. But we end up having this great conversation about life, about purpose, about what it's all for, about I guess different ways to see the world and the problems or the opportunities that we see from our own perspective. And it was just such a beautiful, like hour-long conversation with this guy that I guess generally I probably in the past wouldn't have given much time to. And one of the things that he was so afraid of, like he called money the devil.
Mm.
And one of his relatives passed away a few years ago and gave him a ton of money. And he was so scared of it. He was so scared of it. He before he even started like integrating the money into his life, he already had his partner at the time, his friends like changing their behavior, expecting things, and he just saw the devil everywhere from his perspective and in his language. And he just ended up giving it all away. And again, it pushed him to living this nomadic life in the city of the Gold Coast, which he for argument's sake, he was definitely above baseline in terms of happiness and in terms
Sure.
of gratitude and in terms of these
Yeah.
things
Of
that,
of
yeah,
course you can be. And the interesting chicken egg question is, well, couldn't he have lived that same nomadic lifestyle with all the
yeah,
money? Of course he could have. But my sense is that there was a fear of having to tell someone no. And then when people projected onto him that he's now this different person with money, that was, it feels like maybe their projection. He was afraid that maybe they were right, or maybe that it would change things. And so rather than feeling through that fear and learning how to be the alchemist of that energy and transmute it, he made the choice that he didn't want to have the experience of transmuting discomfort to comfort. And that's totally appropriate. Like
absolutely.
we all get to choose what we choose. But oftentimes in scenarios like that, that person then becomes an advocate against something like
Yes.
money. And that's a flawed premise, because there's no such thing as good or bad. There's only what you emotionally align yourself with.
Yeah, it's your perception of anything that makes it good or bad. Good or bad is a spectrum, and bad is nothing without. Like, how do you know something's bad without good, and
Right.
vice
even
versa? They're not
even the
opposites;
most
they're two. Yeah,
tragic thing that you could think of could potentially become a catalyzing event that allows someone to accelerate their desire and their vision for what they want to a level where they then get to help millions of people. And so if there's a world or a universe where we're choosing into our video game experience and we're setting up the chess pieces of our life so that we will actualize the thing that we want to actualize, who's to say that the tragic event isn't something that we chose because we knew that was the only thing that would be enough
that would get
tension on
us
the
to.
line to snap us across the room? We don't know. And so to label anything as being overtly evil is I think a limited perspective. It's labeling things from the ground rather than that balcony view. And of course, it doesn't mean that in the moment it's not tragic, and that you're not going to have to process those feelings, and that the people that perpetrated you don't need to have consequences for their actions. And you know everyone needs to feel their feelings of that moment. The perpetrator needs to feel the guilt and shame. The victim needs to feel the shame and powerlessness. Like there needs to be an alchemical transmutation of that energy. But if we're gonna play, you know, if we're gonna feel into like how does reality actually work, it's not 100% obvious that we don't choose catalytic events like that because we know that they will move us into such a powerful direction that it will be impossible for us to not actualize the things that we want. And that could be that we help millions of other people from having to go through that scenario. We become an inspiration for people. We feel our own powerlessness in the most vivid way possible because we know so well what disempowerment feels like. So again, you know, it's a hot topic to say that there's no such thing as good and bad, but of course, everything is an interpretation problem or challenge, and we can interpret things from many perspectives, and likely the people who are most lit up and the most capable of navigating reality are able to see many of those perspectives. They're able to see how something could be labeled both bad and good, and then they're able to feel through any discomfort that comes up and actualize it in a way that serves the most amount of people.
They can see the silver lining in the clouds. And that's why, from my perspective, a faith-based game is so powerful, because it allows you to see, or to align with a perspective that is positive regardless of the external catalysm. I think the other thing at the root of this man was the fear that he couldn't trust himself.
Yes.
Which, yeah, that's that's a fear that we could spend probably an hour unpacking at one
Sure.
stage in the future.
Well, it's
Mm.
probably the deepest fear that we all have, you know, because nobody knows our sins or mistakes better than we do, and so then if we haven't felt through all the guilt and shame of that, it projects itself forward as I won't be a good steward of this, and so then we actualize that experience of not being a good steward, but true forgiveness of self is feeling through the shame and guilt of everything, that of all the mistakes that we've made, to the point where we can think about them and talk about them and not be triggered by them anymore. And at that point, we can move forward without having to carry all of that, the elephant of emotional baggage with us.
Yes, we can move forward with courage, and to move forward courageously isn't to move with the absence of fear. You know, there's no such thing
Right.
as the absence of fear.
Right. You want to be you don't want to be somebody who is avoiding fearful things and like always trying to live in this,
Be
you know,
comfortable.
actualized silver lining. You want to be somebody who can walk through lions dens. You want to know, yeah, this is dangerous, but I'm somebody who's capable of doing it.
Yeah, that cliche quote, which I love, is you'd rather be a samurai in a garden than a gardener in a war. And
Right.
I just think that is just so beautiful, so beautiful. It's the ultimate responsibility, I guess, for me. At the end of the day, I want to be able to feel competent. I want to be competent in aspects of my life. I want to start a family, and therefore I want to be a competent father, but also competent with my financials, a competent partner to my partner, a competent business owner, a competent mentor, a competent coach, a competent mentee, a competent learner, a competent that for me, I guess, stemmed from a lot of my own fear work and shadow work. You know, like, what am I genuinely afraid of? Well, uh, I'm afraid of reactionary emotional behavior all the way up the scale, because I've seen the worst part of myself. I've fucking looked at him in the eye, and he is someone that I do not like. But again, the good and the bad and the good. There's a lot of passion in that guy. There's a lot of conviction in that guy. There's a lot of purpose in that guy. And to link this back to alchemy, you can transmute all of that. It's not one thing to repress and run away from that potentially angry, emotional man, but it's to understand that man, understand him as a part of me. And that's been a key part of my own sort of journey in the last 5 to 10 years, is not running away from that man. I think that's how people pleasing actually manifests from my perspective. Other than the insecurity thing, it's also, I do not even want to be in a position where that guy can come out.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like I overcorrect and just want, again, I don't want there to even be the chance that I get angry and emotional. I'm speaking about a
Right.
past
Well,
self,
because
but yeah.
when you're unwilling to feel your own discomfort, it manifests as manic behavior, and manic behavior is me in a frenzy trying to avoid or make sure that everything's perfect. Like that's what people pleasing is.
Yeah.
It's okay if I can just get everything perfect. Okay, like that's manic behavior, and manic behavior is just an indication that there's more to feel.
Beautiful, man. Beautiful. Any last points on fear from your perspective, John? I really enjoyed this, by the way.
Yeah, it's the where the upgrade lives always. So, if you can reframe it in your mind as, ooh, I'm really afraid of this. I wonder what the upgrade on the other side is. And how do you activate the upgrade? You allow that fear to play itself out in your system. You don't resist it at all.
Absolutely. And you move forward courageously. You either win or you learn. So you always win.
Right. Well, and the beautiful thing is that if you can give yourself a count to 10 with your fear, you'll find that the fear reduces to a level where taking action doesn't feel forced anymore.
Yeah.
You'll be inspired into taking the next step. And then you'll count to 10 and feel a little bit more, and then be inspired into the next step. And over time, you'll feel through enough of it where the path is very clear.
So we've got the count to 10 strategy, and that is beautiful for all negative emotions, from my perspective, just to create space between the emotion and your behavior. So valuable. You've got the creating a picture of the worst case scenario of what you fear ultimately. And then on the back of that, transmuting that energy into what happens if it all goes perfectly, and start aligning to that beautiful state of being that you'll not only work towards as your standard follows. We have the perception to see fear as a catalyzing event. I think that's really important. On the hero's journey, it is always a catalyzing event that creates the hero. Batman's parents died. Superman's planet blew up. Like it is something that is seen in the journey of the hero so commonly. And it is the hero that stands up and uses that as a linchpin or a diving board into how can I help others not ever feel the same thing. So we've got some really good practical strategies for one, but at the end of it all, at the bottom of it all, it's to fucking feel it, bruv.
Right. I mean, all of that is a way to dip your toe into just sitting in silence. And when you can do that regularly, you don't need to do anything else.
John, as always, mate, absolute pleasure. Appreciate it. This is great.
Yeah. If you've had those viewers that are watching, if you've made it this far and you've had an experience with fear and have an interesting way that you were able to transmute it or work through that, definitely leave it in the comments so that you can inspire somebody else. And if there's a direction that you'd like us to go in some of these chats, let us know, and we will be tuning into that as time goes on. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.